Welcome, everybody, to today's ExpandED talk. ExpandED is a virtual brown bag series hosted by the Circle Center in the College of Education at Texas Tech, where we feature education researchers, leaders, and stakeholders from the US and abroad. Today's speaker is Dr. Kathy Rollo, who is in her 5th year as superintendent at Lubbock ISD and has dedicated over 3 decades of her life to advancing public education. As a native of Lubbock, Texas, her passion for teaching was nurtured within the very school district she now leads as superintendent. Graduating from Texas Tech with her bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees, Dr. Rollo's academic journey showcases her deep-rooted connection to our local community and our treasured partnership between Lubbock ISD and Circle. Dr. Rollo has held various roles within Lubbock ISD, ranging from classroom teacher to principal to associate superintendent. Having worked with Dr. Rollo's team for 4 years now, I can personally attest that she is guided by her belief in data-driven decision-making, a genuine compassion for individuals, and a cultivation of strong leadership, and how it's paramount to fostering positive change within our education system. Today, Dr. Rollo will share her insights on a critical topic facing public education. You all know this if you are paying attention to Texas education policy: the ongoing discourse surrounding school choice and its implications it carries for our education landscape. Having weathered the storms of both local as well as state debates and policy and decision-making, Dr. Rollo brings a wealth of experience and perspective to this conversation. I'm very excited. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Rollo.
Thank you so much, Jacob. I appreciate the introduction. Thank you all for having me today. I hope that this can be interactive. So if you have questions as I'm speaking, please don't hesitate to jump in. But of course, we'll have time for questions at the end as well. I think I was invited to do this today because I also serve on the Texas Tech College of Education Alumni Advisory Board. And so I was in a meeting and just happened to get on a soapbox, and I had to actually leave the meeting early to get onto a Zoom call with other superintendents from around the state. And this was right in the middle of the legislative session. And so we were doing our best to try to advocate behind the scenes for public schools. And so I believe that's why I was invited to give this presentation today. I will say that I definitely have my own personal views around this, but for this presentation, I'm really going to try to just share information, share facts and information without getting on a soapbox too much. But I definitely do have my own belief system around this. And I don't know that I can keep that from coming out to a degree, but I just want to make sure people in our community are informed of what school choice really is and what this means and potential ramifications for it. So hold on, let me see if I can move my screen forward. Okay, that's not working. There it is. Okay. So today what I'm going to cover briefly is just what is school choice. And I put that in quotation marks because that is the language that is being used around that. And then talk about the current landscape in Texas, some driving forces behind school choice. We'll talk about some potential ramifications for public education as we know it. And then, of course, time for questions and discussion at the end. So starting with what is school choice? Okay, I'm not sure why I'm struggling with this. So what is school choice when we hear that language? It really refers to programs and policies that let families use public money to access schools beyond their local traditional school district options. So examples of school choice could be charter schools, which are currently in the state of Texas. They are public schools. They're funded with public money, but they are not part of an independent school district. We also have private schools within our community, so that's often referred to as a school choice. Homeschooling is a school choice that that a lot of families take advantage of, and we've seen an increase in the number of families who are choosing to homeschool their children since the pandemic. And then vouchers are when we give public funds, taxpayer dollars, to access these different choices. So school choice proponents, people who are supportive of basically what they're calling education savings accounts or vouchers. The people who are proponents of that, some things that they say is that it gives parents more freedom, it equalizes access to school quality and creates incentives for public school systems to improve their performance. So those are the things that we hear proponents of school choice saying, that it will actually make our traditional public schools better if there are more options for families. The people who are more public school advocates talk about how public funds should be reserved for schools that serve and accommodate all students and are held to the same accountability standards as public schools. And so those are things that you hear from the people who are really public school advocates. So what does this look like right now in Texas? Texas has a very diverse educational landscape, and we have various options, which include public schools, charter schools, and private schools. Within our own Lubbock community, you see all of these different options. But recent legislative sessions, and this is not new, this has come up every session for the last, as long as I've been in education, we've heard about school choice and paying for these options with public dollars. So we've seen this for years, but the last session was the one that it actually became the topic of conversation, with public school advocates pushing back against any voucher proposals, and then supporters of school choice pouring money and political capital into minimizing the opposition for vouchers. So school choice in Texas, this was actually a quote by our governor, Greg Abbott, in January of 2022. He said, "Parents should not be forced to send their child to a government-mandated school that teaches critical race theory or is forcing their child to wear a mask against their parents' desire, or is forcing them to attend a school that isn't safe." And so that's just a quote that he gave in January of 2022, which started the conversations that led into the legislative session. In the 2023 regular session, it ended without any significant school choice legislation, even with heavily campaigning by the governor, which was good. We won the battle in the 2023 session against vouchers, but the battle is definitely not over. There were 4 special sessions that followed the regular session, and again, no choice legislation passed, but every bill was also tied to additional funding for public schools. And so as a result, it says no additional school funding. We did get a little bit of additional funding. We received a slight increase in our school safety allotment per student from $9, and I can't remember the exact number of cents, to $10 per student. And then we also received $15,000 per campus for school safety. But the requirements that also came out of the session cost much, much more than that additional money that we received. We had a special task force before this session about teacher retention and recruitment. And one of the big recommendations that came out of that was something around teacher compensation and additional money so that we could provide raises for teachers, and that none of that made it through the sessions. Governor Abbott and the school choice supporters have definitely doubled down since that session. And you can see that in the news on a regular basis. Even in the recent primaries, Governor Abbott definitely he spent $4.4 million on challengers to the 10 House Republicans who voted against the voucher proposals. He made endorsements in several races, including several seats that were left open by retiring members, in an attempt to turn 11 seats over to candidates who support helping parents pay for private school tuition with taxpayer dollars. The final number of voucher supporters who will be in the House next year still remains undetermined due to the number of GOP House incumbents heading to a runoff election. But the movement clearly gained some significant ground in this primary election. And what are some of the driving forces behind school choice? So some of the things that you hear are about parental empowerment. You hear that parents want the ability to choose the best educational option for their children based on their child's unique needs, interests, and learning styles. They say that school choice provides parents with the opportunity to select schools that align with their values and priorities. But I will say that especially here in Lubbock ISD, but in districts across the state, we are doing what we can to make sure that parents have options within our own school districts right now. Even within Lubbock ISD, each of our high schools has a specialized program from International Baccalaureate to project-based learning, to our early college high school, which is a partnership with Texas Tech at Estacado High School. So you'll see that we offer choice within our own school district boundaries so that every child can find the best fit, and parents have the ability to make those choices. You hear about quality of education, that school choice advocates argue that competition among schools leads to improved quality of education. In other words, the competition between these different options makes us all better, is what the advocates say. When parents have options beyond their assigned district schools, schools are incentivized to improve academic performance, facilities, and extracurricular offerings to attract students. That's what the proponents of school vouchers say. I would argue that school districts have very high accountability standards and are constantly working to improve our schools with the resources that we have. You hear people talking about we need school choice to meet the diverse needs of our students, that every child has different learning needs and preferences, and that school choice allows parents to find schools that cater to their child's specific requirements, whether it's a focused STEM education, arts, language immersion, or alternative teaching methods. But unlike private and charter schools, public schools accept all children. Lubbock ISD, if a child lives in our boundaries, they are ours. Other schools, private schools, charter schools, do not accept all children. One of the things you also hear is about flexibility and innovation, that school choice encourages diversity in educational approaches. It fosters the creation of specialized schools, charter schools, magnet schools, and online education programs that offer innovative teaching methods and curriculum, promoting experimentation and adaptation to changing educational needs. And again, I would say that our public school districts have worked very hard to have flexible options for families and are always open to innovative ways of teaching students. And that is evidenced across our district with the options and programs that we offer. One of the things that you hear behind school choice is that it's a way to address failing schools. In areas with underperforming traditional public schools, they say that school choice provides an escape route for families seeking better educational opportunities. By allowing students to transfer to higher performing schools, whether public, charter, or private. They say that school choice can pressure low performing schools to improve or face declining enrollment. But what we've seen is that negative consequences have occurred in other states, and that includes market fragmentation, variability in quality, and an exacerbation of educational inequalities around that. And then you hear about promoting equity, that proponents of school choice say that it promotes equity by giving all families, regardless of their socioeconomic status, the ability to access high quality education. Programs like vouchers or tax credits, they say, could help lower income families afford private school tuition, thus reducing educational disparities. But again, private and charter schools right now are not obligated to accept all students who apply. So they can pick and choose the students who attend their schools. And one of the things that we've seen in other states where vouchers are already in effect is that the private schools have raised the tuition by the same amount of the voucher. And so it doesn't necessarily make it easier for low-income families to access them if the tuition is just doubled by the price of the voucher. You hear proponents of school choice and vouchers say that we need to provide this for political and ideological reasons. Some advocates for school choice say that it aligns with their beliefs and the importance of free market, limited government intervention in education, or the principle of educational pluralism, which supports diverse educational options. Prioritizing free market principles in education may lead to the commodification of schooling, where education becomes viewed primarily as a consumer good rather than a fundamental right, and resulting in an emphasis on competition and profit motives rather than a basic right to a free and public education for all students. And then you hear proponents of school choice and vouchers saying that it's what parents want. They say that when parents have a say in their child's education through school choice, they often feel more engaged and satisfied with the educational process, and that this can lead to increased parental involvement in schools and a stronger sense of community. We did have Raise Your Hand Texas did a survey of parents prior to the legislative session, and 70% of parents did not support public funds going to public schools. And over 90% of parents were very, very satisfied with their public school. So you hear that people say that parents want this, but that's not necessarily what the data is revealing in some surveys that we've seen. Some of the political ramifications behind the school choice movement, a big piece of this are funding concerns. Voucher programs could divert funding away from our public schools, impacting the resources and quality of education that public schools can provide for students. For example, the immediate biennial cost, sorry, it says BOST, it should be cost. The immediate biennial cost for just the students right now who are in private schools or homeschool, the immediate cost would be $461.8 million. And that's for students who are currently right now in private or homeschool settings if they were to receive the vouchers. The estimated cost for the next biennium is $4 billion. The biennial cost funding only current homeschool at $1,000 per student and private school students, $7.3 billion. The biennial cost, if the full voucher amount is applied to all private and homeschool students as called for by Governor Abbott, $21 billion. If all eligible students, including public, private, and homeschool students, received the 10,500 ESA, which was one of the proposed amounts in the session, the annual cost would be $63 billion. And this information is coming from the Texas Equity Center. So funding is a very real concern. Some of the House Republicans who voted against the voucher bills, and they have, one of them is, he said, I get the school choice, I get all of that, but I'm a businessman and this is not sustainable. We cannot, as a state, afford to sustain 3 different public funds going to regular school districts, charter schools, and then a voucher program. It's just not sustainable. Another potential ramification of school choice is segregation. Critics argue that school choice could exacerbate socioeconomic and racial segregation, as affluent families may have more access to educational options. And again, private schools do not have to accept every student who applies, nor do they have the space to accept all of the students who apply. So there are some segregation concerns. And the initial voucher movement that started years ago was based on the desire after Brown versus Board of Education to keep schools segregated. And so vouchers are rooted in keeping schools segregated. There are some accountability of public fund concerns. Questions arise regarding the accountability of private and charter schools receiving public funds as they operate with less oversight than traditional public schools. In Arizona, for example, which has one of the largest voucher programs in the country, parents have spent hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars on some fraudulent and questionable purchases, including buying chicken coops, trampolines, and tickets to SeaWorld. Our public schools, as you guys very well know, are highly accountable both fiscally and for student outcomes. Because we are using taxpayer dollars to educate students in a fundamental right. But our private schools don't have that same level of accountability and oversight. There's also concerns about impact on student achievement. Both domestic and international studies of voucher programs over the last 20 years show no significant difference in student achievement, even when taking socioeconomic factors into account. And then some equity considerations. Research conducted by the National Education Policy Institute in 2022 found that equity has been little more than an afterthought in the development and implementation of these policies. Based on interviews conducted with 58 state policymakers and experts in Colorado, Florida, Louisiana, Michigan, and Oregon, states selected with an eye to including a diverse set of geographic, demographic, and school choice policy settings. So there definitely are some concerns related to potential ramifications. Another one that is not included on here, but something that I think is worth bringing to our attention is just within our own community, we are responsible for developing our future workforce. And I don't know if you guys have been to our Byron Martin ATC, Advanced Technology Center, but we are preparing kids to go to college. But we also know that that's not going to be every child's destiny. Some children have no desire to go to college. And the truth is, we need people who are very highly trained in how to design an electrical system in a house. We need welders, we need plumbers, we need construction people, construction workers, we need chefs. We need all of those kids with highly skilled training programs to be able to go into our workforce. So there's an economic concern that if school choice options expand, fewer kids are going to have access to those training programs. I don't know of a private school within Lubbock that offers even close to what we offer in Lubbock ISD around job preparation. And so that's a concern too from an economic standpoint in having kids ready to go into the workforce. And so that's just something else to consider as well that's not necessarily on this list. And so that's what I have to share with you, but I would love to hear your thoughts, questions, or concerns, ideas around this school choice push within our Texas legislators right now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rollo. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or take yourself off mute and ask Dr. Rollo yourself. Yeah, go ahead.
So Dr. Rollo, thank you so much for spending time with us and sharing this. This is so interesting, and so interesting to hear from someone in your specific position about this topic. So my question is, as people kind of engage with public education, how do you think we share this message with kind of policy actors? Like, and I guess beyond that, like, is the push, like, is it lack of knowledge about the things you're talking about? Is it like what's behind this? And then how do we best share this information with people engaged in this?
I think one thing that's important to note is the cost. I don't think people understand just how expensive this can be. And another thing that I think people don't consider is that our local school districts across the state, again, received very, very little new funding out of this session. And unfortunately, people don't always pay attention until it hurts. I was visiting with Jacob about this before we started. Districts across the state are having to make some very, very difficult decisions right now around staffing, because that's our largest cost is staffing, programming. And so people are going to start seeing that school districts aren't going to be able to do as much because we have limited resources. And the same increase in expenses that you guys see in your households when you go to the grocery store or fill your car up with gas, school districts are facing those same increases in costs. So I think we've just got to make sure, I think until parents really get engaged and help share this message, I don't know that we're going to make any headway here until they really get engaged. So our PTAs have tried to advocate, but again, I think we've just got to make sure that they are armed with information.
Thank you. That's really interesting.
Dr. Payton asked in the chat, why do you think the Republican representatives in rural districts have been opposed to school choice? What values or influences support their positions?
Rural districts, Republicans have been opposed because they understand the impact that it will have on their local districts. And they don't have, our little teeny tiny towns around us don't have private schools. And so, you know, they understand the impact it will have on their local districts. The homeschool option, again, is a big concern. And then there is a concern about online options being a part of this as well, and that could affect rural districts as well.
A few reasons why parents are leaving the school system in favor of charter and private schools. In my prior experience as a high school administrator, I found that the reason a number of staff and families left was their concern about behavior and what their kids were exposed to in the school system. Are those issues being addressed with the constituents so they see the value in the public school system? How are they dealing with some of these issues and stakeholders so that there's not a large push to withdraw and take the funding elsewhere?
So I had a difficult time hearing you, but I think you were asking about people expressing concerns with behaviors in public schools. Okay, yes. So absolutely, that is something that that we are addressing and districts across the state are addressing. Particularly, we started well before the pandemic, but particularly after the pandemic, we have seen increases in some of the behavioral concerns with students coming out of some traumatic situations. So in Lubbock ISD and across the state, really, school districts have increased what we're doing around what we call social emotional learning. So being proactive in teaching kids skills on how to resolve conflict, how to self-regulate if they're feeling out of control. So that's a proactive approach that we're taking. I'm also serving on a task force with some other superintendents from around the state to really make some suggestions around Chapter 37, which is some of the laws that govern what we can and can't do around behavior in the state. And so we're making some suggestions around that before the next legislative session. So it is something that I do understand can be a concern. I would I would argue that one of the things that is challenging with the voucher program is that if a student does receive a voucher and goes to a private school and then they act inappropriately, guess what that student's going to do? But we take all kids and we're going to work with all kids. We consider it our mission and our charge to help prepare those students to be good citizens when they graduate from us. And so we're going to work with kids using the resources that we have to ensure that students are learning those behavioral and social skills in addition to the academic skills that they need.
Dr. Rollo, I have a question, and it's related to the topic of school choice, but it also, I think, asks you just maybe speak more broadly to your role as superintendent. Not only superintendent, but someone who is widely recognized across the state, right? Like being in the Holtworth Center, you've done just such great work. I'm curious, when it comes to things like thinking about the legislative session, knowing that this is a very high stakes situation where there's not a predicted outcome. It's a very 50-50. Do you play a role in any of those conversations happening at the state level? Or how would you characterize, your role as superintendent when policy issues like that really come to the surface?
That's a great question. And it's one that's it's a hard position to be in because as a public school employee, which is what I am, we really are not allowed to advocate one way or another. So that's why we really try to share more of just the facts behind the issue. That being said, Lubbock ISD is part of the Texas School Alliance, which is 42 of the larger districts in the state of Texas. And so I serve on the board of that organization, and we have lots and lots of sessions and conversations around what's the best way to try to educate and inform and work with our legislative delegation around these important issues, this one being the top of mind in the last few years. So we're working behind the scenes. I meet with our delegation here in Lubbock and share, concerns, questions, information, potential impact. That's something that we do on a regular basis. I do think that trustees, our board, they are elected officials, and so they often have more pull with our legislative delegation, with it being an elected official to an elected official, because we're often seen as just whiny school people. And so I think it's really important for school boards to, I'll use one of our upcoming trustee, Nancy Sharp. She is at large and she's unopposed. So something she said yesterday is we need to lock arms with other school boards and really share this information, and she's spot on with that.
Dr. Rollo, how are you today?
I'm great. How are you, Dr. Molina?
Doing great. Keep sending us some more candidates over here. We're always recruiting. Just a couple of thoughts here. You mentioned the funding concern, which is try to sustain regular charter and then try to throw in a voucher system. For example, in the charter system, one in particular that's a large representation in the state idea, as you're probably aware, are under TEA,
Yes.
monitoring for extensive expenditures, for example, buying an executive jet to send to administrators to various campuses and things like that. So from the funding aspect and overall state spending within your networking, how are y'all addressing that? And also, as I'm sure you're aware, there is a substantial amount of external funding to support vouchers. I believe there's a billionaire out of North Carolina or something that contributed a substantial amount of money to the groups that's proposing vouchers. So what are your thoughts on
Yes.
funding and countering all that?
So the charter funding, yes. The charter network has definitely grown substantially. That's already in existence. So the law behind that is already there. And I mean, we have charter schools within Lubbock ISD boundaries. So within that, we're trying to just continue to recruit. And again, we often see students in charter schools coming back to us. And that happens on a pretty regular basis, usually right before the STAR test, ironically, but that's something that we see. And so we're trying to just continue to recruit and share our message and encourage families to choose Lubbock ISD. Interestingly, this is kind of a side note on charters. A lot of people don't know that for an original charter to be approved, that goes through the State Board of Education. So the State Board actually has to sign off on new charter schools that want to open. If it's an existing school, an existing charter school that wants to expand, that just requires the commissioner's signature. And so IDEA and some of the other huge charter networks that you see across the state, for expanding those, that does not go to our State Board of Education. That just goes to the commissioner's desk. So that's just an interesting side note that I thought I would share with you. As far as the funding that is going behind the voucher movement, you are correct, Dr. Molina, that there have been billions of dollars poured into that. I shared earlier just how much money Governor Abbott put into campaigns against our House Republicans who were not supportive of vouchers. So if you haven't read the March issue of Texas Monthly, I encourage you to look at that article because it does share more information about the financial input behind that. We can't fight that. We don't have the financial resources to fight, to put toward this like they do. So we're going to have to do it through other grassroots efforts that I mentioned earlier, with getting more parents engaged and involved and informed about this.
Is there an element of accountability for, let's say it does pass, for private schools, or is that off the table? They have their own, they're non-accountable.
I will share that Senator Perry, who is our local representative, the voucher proposals flew through the Senate. I mean, they were strongly in favor of them, but he did try to put some guardrails, and one of those is that they would be held to the same accountabilities. If they accept vouchers, that they would be held to the same accountability standards regarding student outcomes that public schools are held to. And of course, the private networks are very, very opposed to that.
Right.
And one of the reasons that people sometimes say they choose private school is so that they're not held to the same, they don't want their kids taking the STAR test.
Right.
But private schools do have some accountability for their accreditation, but it's not even close to the same level.
Do you know if Senator Perry's amendment passed?
No, it did not. But he tried.
In some of those states that already have vouchers in place, do you know of any constitutional challenges in terms of separation of state and church?
I'm not aware of any, but that doesn't mean that has not existed.
Okay, so potentially that could happen in Texas if it passes. Let's say from a taxpayer's perspective, that you're taking public funds and going to a private school, that to me is troubling from that perspective.
Oh, Valerie just said there's a case in Oklahoma Supreme Court this week. I'm not familiar with that, but that's
Oh, okay.
interesting. Yeah.
We'll keep an eye on that one.
I have a second question that's sort of a pivot from this. So we're talking a lot about like, why are people doing things? How are they thinking about things? All of that. And this is like for my students and former students on the call, as researchers, like, how do we share what we know with people that are making policy or thinking about policy or advocating for policy, right? Like Jacob's been dropping links in the chat the whole time. Like we know a lot about the effects of vouchers. Like we know all of this stuff. And I guess my question is like, do people not know? Do we need to be better about sharing that? Do they know and like not care? Like what's happening there?
Oh, I wish I had the answer to that question. I fear it's the latter, that they know, and the private donors who are feeding into this movement are speaking louder than the data that you're sharing. But I think Raise Your Hand Texas, if you're not familiar with that organization, they put together quite a bit of information and do a lot of advocating and lobbying at the state level. And then the Equity Center is another great organization that does some advocacy and lobbying. Those are two that are leading in that area.
I'm going to speak to Jessica, who's just my counterpart, I think, in life, in some ways. She and I have some similar paths. I think that the etiology of this issue is totally ideological. And I think that if we act like it's not, we're just deceiving ourselves. There's plenty of evidence, but it's really interesting, actually. James Durham's father wrote his dissertation around secularization of Texas public education, 30, 40 years ago. It's a book that you can't get called Secular Darkness that I've asked to read. And so this issue, I think, is deeply affective, emotional, ideological, and is not going to be addressed by data. And so I think we need to think, it's part of the reason why I asked about the rural Republicans, because the rural Republicans are leading, the representation of their communities and their community values. And they blocked school vouchers, school choice to date. And so the question is, what can we learn from them about how they represent their community, the whole aspect of their community, and the ideologies that are represented in their community, and yet stand as representatives for those people and activistically move for healthy public K through 12. What can we learn from them? And I'm thankful for Senator Perry on that subject, but what can we learn from them? Because even if it's important to have evidence, but I don't think that the issue is evidence-based at this point.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, right? I think my concern or frustration then comes from the asymmetry of like almost everyone on this call is employed by a state agency, right? Like we're limited by what we can do and say and advocate for by professional roles in ways that other people aren't. And so then I feel frustrated with sort of like, how do you engage on an ideological level when you're not supposed to be doing that as a public employee or a state actor?
I think it becomes a messaging issue, and that's one of the things that public schools have never had to do, in my opinion, is really advertise, not with those words, but really put the message out of what public schools offer, how they support the community, in favor of these other schools who are reaching a whole nother identity and a whole nother rationale that is not actually factual when you're looking at parent surveys and how happy are they with the school. That message is not getting out. And then they need to hear that public schools hear where their concerns are and that they have plans to address things that may be of concern. But that messaging is just not getting out there to that general public that's embracing the vouchers. And having been in the private sector of education, I'm telling you, there is not much difference in what is provided. And often in charter schools and some of these smaller private schools, they're not getting as good a quality and they're not having as many opportunities as they would in public school. And that needs to be pushed to the forefront. Do you know what you're giving up when you leave a public school system?
Yeah. That's a great point, and something that we grapple with all of the time. You see in airports, they advertise. You see some charter networks and some private schools, and we do have a communications office, but again, we push the vast majority of our resources go to our schools so that we can have the programming that we do have and the staff that we have. And so we have not spent a large amount of resources on advertising to the general public. So, but that's something that we grapple with. How do we get that message out and tell our story? And again, we do it in lots of ways, but I agree, it's not getting out to everybody. In visiting with some rural legislators, one of the things that I've heard them share is in a smaller school community, the public school is like the foundation of that community. There's one high school and one middle school, and sometimes maybe 2 elementary schools, but the schools are the hub of the community. And there's a great deal of pride in that school. Friday night football, the entire community goes to the games. It is the center of the community. And when you move to larger, more urban districts like Lubbock ISD, and we're not even a huge urban, we're a mid-urban, but when you go into those communities, even though we try to build that feeder pattern pride within a high school and its middle schools and elementaries that feed into it, it's hard to replicate that in a larger city. Now, we have economies of scale, so we can offer a lot more choices to families in a larger school district than some of the small rurals do. But going back to the value that the rural legislators see in the small communities, I mean, it goes back to the value of that hometown pride that smaller school districts can rely on. And that's what's really helped, I think, to keep the vouchers at bay. But again, that is changing.
I think a real key idea you mentioned was that superintendents as public ed employees have to have a neutral position on the politics. As you know, there's some school districts that have been sued by the Attorney General for taking a political stand as well. But I think that the resource there, the potential resource, is the board governance piece, where those individual board members can really form a strong coalition, I think, in order to bring out some of that information that could give us a balanced view of what public ed is versus the vouchers as well. So in your grouping and your networking, have y'all had any conversation on how to avoid lawsuits from the Attorney General in terms or guidance on that? Or
We have, I mean, yes, just last week with Denton ISD. So yes.
Right. Yeah, that's a tough deal there. That's to balance that out.
Dr. Rollo, so we've talked a lot about kind of perspective, thinking about like what might we do when we consider this upcoming inevitable debate. My concern, and I'll try not to get too dark here, is what happens if like this were to pass and vouchers were to go into effect. And in particular, my concern is for teachers and educators within schools. As someone who, you've been an educator for a while, you interact daily with educators. Can you share what are teachers talking about if they are talking about issues of school choice? And I guess forecasting, what do you think happens to the role of a traditional public school teacher in a world where you have vouchers?
Oh, that's a that's a tough question. Teachers, for the most part, and it's the truth. Educators are terrible about getting to the polls. And that's something that, we try to create within our district, a pro-voting culture. And so, that's one aspect of it. I don't hear the teacher groups really having a lot of conversations around this, other than they know that they didn't get a raise. I mean, we did not give a raise for this school year because we were hopeful that money would come from the state, but we also were worried about, committing the district to money that may or may not exist. And so that's really what they're most concerned about, is how it affects their livelihood and their well-being. Now, we didn't give a raise, but we had the ESSER money that ends this year. So we were able to give a retention bonus with using ESSER funds. And then we also used some fund balance and gave them a one-time lump sum bonus in November. So we did give they actually are making more this year than they did last year with that. But as far as a raise that commits the district permanently, we're not comfortable doing that. So I think that there is some concern, but it's really more about how it affects their pocketbooks and their livelihood. And I will say that the rhetoric behind the push with vouchers, saying that we're indoctrinating kids and we're exposing kids to pornography in our libraries, and the rhetoric behind it is demoralizing. And so I think some of the long-term implications, we try to cover our teachers, in a bubble and protect them from some of that, but they turn on the news and they hear it. So I think one of the long-term ramifications could be further exacerbating the teacher shortage that we face. People just not going into the profession. In Lubbock ISD, at least, we're not seeing a huge mass exodus from the profession that you hear about in the national news, but we do have fewer and fewer people going into the profession. And we have more non-traditionally certified teachers than we've ever had, which has implications for a college of education as well, which does a phenomenal job preparing teachers.
We have about 5 more minutes if there are any other questions. Okay.
Well, thank you
Well,
all for your interest in this topic. Please continue to follow it. Please continue to be a voice for public schools and the important role public schools play in our society, in our world.
absolutely. I want to thank everyone for dedicating an hour of your time to listen to Dr. Rollo. But Dr. Rollo, this was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise and experience with us. This was an extremely engaging talk, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right. Goodbye, everyone.